Welcome back, strategic angling fans. This is a special episode. We got 3 excellent anglers, and I'm going to get out of the way so there's still 3 and not 4. My name is Brady Hanna. I used to be the host of this show, but these 3 are going to take it away this one. They're going to talk about finesse jigs. That's not something I'm an expert on. So I got Tanner Bock, state champion, JJ Patton, state champion, and then we have TIm Himsl. TIm Himsl, take it away.
All right, guys, so we're going to talk about finesse jigs. We've done a thing on flipping jigs, and finesse jig is kind of, we were just kind of going over it. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. So, you know, in general, a finesse jig would probably be one that you would be using if you were targeting fishing cleaner water, colder water, maybe spotted bass, maybe a little smaller profile than our regular skirted rubber jigs that we would flip on the river most of the time. Now, finesse jigs come in all sizes. You can get ball heads, football heads, you can get Arky style heads, you can get bullet heads. But in general, what we're talking about is a snack size morsel that a bass would like to eat, maybe under heavily pressured conditions or cleaner water where you want a more natural presentation than some big jig with a double wide beaver falling down on top of them, you know. So we were going to kind of go over some options that are available. You know, in general, when we're fishing these, we're going to be using lighter line, lighter rods. We're not using our 20-pound fluorocarbon. We're using, you know, 12, 14, 15, even lower. Maybe fishing deeper, cleaner, usually maybe around rock or docks. You know, a lot of guys down in the Ozarks fish that little brown jig, they call it. It's a ball head jig, about 5/16 ounces, and they use that and skip it around the docks and stuff, and that works everywhere. I mean, it looks like a crawdad or maybe a bluegill or a bait fish. It can kind of imitate whatever you want. So thought we'd just kind of go through some different options. Tanner, you go ahead and start.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is a little bit, or can be a little bit different on some of the finesse jigs is just the skirting material like JJ talked about. So your typical jigs will have the silicone stuff most of the time. One of the better applications I've found for some of the finesse jigs are in your colder water, which sometimes, you know, the skirting material you want to go for there is something a little bit more natural. So your hair jigs, which have a little bit more of a subtle action, or in this case I got a marabou jig here, which is basically just feathers, but that's kind of the same deal. It's just something more subtle that gives it a little bit slower action, not quite as, you're not looking for a reaction bite, you're trying to coax them into biting sometimes if that water's colder. So
yeah, keep it more lively. You know, that's the trick to it, is keep it looking realistic in the cold water without moving it too much.
Right, yep.
And you got one there that has both hair and it's kind of a mixture there.
I consider this a blend where it has the silicone rubber on it, and it really has like a star pattern on it where it's flared out more, but it also has the hair in it that's going to keep it looking very lively under the water, even in colder water, where it's just really going to stand up for you. So that's something I'm looking at when I'm looking at the finesse jig in cold water.
And I think sometimes if you get, you know, bucktail or some of that hair, I think it changes the rate of fall a little bit too. It gives a little more buoyancy so that jig will fall real slow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just sometimes that can coax a bite out of a fish that may otherwise not bite a rubber jig that just goes zooming right by them.
Yeah, and not to say that it's only a cold water bait either. I mean, sometimes, like, so for example, I fished a BFL on Lake Winneconne, and I found that sometimes the finesse jig was getting a lot more bites flipping docks than a standard Texas rig or a jig, because everybody that flips a dock on Lake Winnebago flips a Texas rig or a jig. So if you throw something a little bit different in front of them, maybe you can generate another bite or two that another guy would have missed, since they've already seen, you know, 4 or 5 Texas rigs that day. Something a little bit different could get an extra bite for you.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, it's almost a big finesse presentation. You know, you go from a Ned rig or a drop shot, and then you give this has a little bit more meat, but it's still moving slow, and it's something different that they don't see every day. You know, I think a lot of companies are coming out with finesse jigs. You know, there's kind of a big boom. You know, Ike has made this micro jig, and Brian Thrift's made a small football jig, and this one here I have is made by Bravarni. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of Dan, and he's done a lot of things. But this is called a little something, and this is just a plain ball head jig. You can see that the top is cut so that it's kind of flared out. I think a lot of times the finesse jigs will do that. We'll
Like a spider jig.
spider the top of it and let the bottom fall, and that just gives it a little different profile. I have a big bite fighting frog on the back that I cut down, and I think that's a nice little subtle trailer. You want kind of a subtle little chunk or a subtle trailer. You don't really want a lot of flap, because if you put something with a lot of legs back here, there's not enough weight or speed to turn those legs, and they just kind of look awkward to me. So you want something subtle and something that kind of flows through naturally.
So would you consider that probably your favorite finesse jig?
Yeah, I think the little something is
go-to.
what I would go to usually. Yeah, I mean, it has a light weed guard. It has a good hook, but it's
Light
not
wire hook.
Yeah, it's a light wire. It's
Yeah.
not a stout flipping hook.
That's definitely something, a light line jig right there.
Yeah, and you can throw this on spinning gear or bait caster. If you have a medium to medium light, medium bait caster, or a spinning rod with braided fluorocarbon, you can skip these things real good. And if you have it on a spinning rod and you're fishing around docks like at McBride or even at Lost Grove, if you're fishing in those trees and you need to skip it underneath, it's a handy way to get a bait to fish that may not see a bait all the time.
Yeah, for sure. So my personal favorite finesse jig is one of these Bitsy flips that we have here. You probably can't see it over there, but a couple things I really like about the Bitsy flip by Strike King is it still has a pretty stout hook on it, so you can easily throw it on a bait caster with 12 plus pound fluorocarbon line. But also you can get these just about anywhere. Matt over at K&K True Value carries them, but you can get them at Walmart, you can get them anywhere. And they're just a well-built, inexpensive jig. They have a pretty light weed guard on them, so you can fish them on a spinning rod pretty easily if you wanted to.
Bass like those.
Great,
Yeah, they do.
Great price point. They're like $3.50 a piece. Too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A very affordable finesse jig.
Yeah.
And they're kind of a crossover finesse jig, like I said, with the heavier hook on it, where you're not sacrificing hook set on it with a lighter hook.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is a little bit more on the heavy side of the finesse. On the little bit of the lighter side of the finesse, you've got something like the Ike's micro jig,
Which is very micro.
which
Yeah.
is I don't think you could throw that on anything but spinning tackle.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe if you had one of the new BFS reels, you could throw it on that.
Only thing smaller, and that's an ice fishing jig.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's almost so small. So when I throw those, the only trailer I put on it is I just cut off a little tiny piece of Senko and just shove it on there just to give it a little bit of weight so I can cast it.
something on it.
But yeah, that's when the bite's really getting tough. That's the real finesse side of finesse jigs.
And when the water's 35 degrees and still open,
Yeah,
that's a lure to use.
absolutely.
Because it is very finesse.
And we
Yeah.
talked about earlier in the year, we had Brady Frank on talking about fishing small streams and stuff, and those jigs excel in small streams where there's like hellgrammites, and you ever go in a small stream and you turn over a rock and all these weird creatures like swim out of the way. They all kind of look like a Ike's micro jig, and I think if you're gonna fish in small water or small streams, that's a fantastic option for you. Because it looks like a lot of things that swim around in those places. And those things are probably in the river, we just don't see them as much,
Yep.
But fish like to eat things that look like that and move around on the bottom because they're full of protein in general. And
Easy targets.
yeah,
Just like a micro jig.
right.
Easy target.
So
So let's talk about rod selection a little bit.
Yeah.
Rod, reel, line. So finesse jig, finesse rod. You don't want to go too heavy with them because predominantly you're using a pretty light wire hook on it, especially if you're talking about a Iconelli micro jig.
Yeah.
Pretty light hook.
Yeah, I don't throw those on anything but a spinning rod.
Absolutely. medium would be the heaviest. Medium light would probably be more what you're leaning towards. I think most of us here are probably using braid to a leader, 10-pound braid to probably a 10 to 8-pound leader.
Yep.
So we're talking pretty light, and that's really going to help balance the lure as it goes down. If you're using straight fluoro, straight mono, probably around 8-pound when you're using a finesse jig of that caliber. And if you want to step it up from there, like me, with a micro Strike King Bitsy flip, I'm going to go up to about a 12 to 14-pound fluorocarbon. That's about the area I want to be with it.
And the nice thing about that one too is if you're around grass or anything, that had these, this thing doesn't come through grass very good. That does. That thing sneaks through brush and grass. It's surprisingly pretty weedless. The weed guard's not super stout, but it's aerodynamic and it comes through. And
the head's almost built like a swim jig a little bit with the vertical line tie.
Yeah, that's a good all around jig when you need to get bit. If you're going somewhere and you're taking a kid or you're
kind of a
struggling
crossover
to
jig
follow
where
them.
it covers different areas in the water pretty nice.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, a spinning rod or a medium light to medium bait casting rod. And
The trick is to keep it light.
A 3-power Dobbins is what I would use on most of these if I was throwing a bait caster, and I would be using one of my reels that I can cast a light lure on. A good magnet, and make sure you got it dialed in good, because otherwise you're going to get frustrated trying to throw it out and it's backlashing on you all the time.
And a little more sensitive rod possibly. A champion extreme, that's kind of where I want to be on that rod selection. More sensitive the better, because the bite's typically going to be a little lighter, because again, a lot of times we're fishing in colder water.
Yeah, I think one thing too, and it comes from ice fishing when you're fishing really light jigs, is you want to make sure if you don't change your line out with any kind of frequency, if you're fishing one of these, you want to try and have fresh line. You don't want to have, if you're fishing fluorocarbon especially, you don't want to have a line that's real coiled super tightly and has a ton of line memory, because first of all, these jigs aren't that heavy, so they're not going to be able to pull that tension out, and you're not going to be able to feel those bites, which, like Tim said, they're going to be pretty light to begin with. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well.
That and that brings up another point too of when you're fishing a jig like this and it's sinking real slow, make sure you watch your line where it goes in the water. If it speeds up suddenly, slows down suddenly, or moves one way or the other, there's a pretty good chance you got a bite. And you may not feel a tick or a thump or anything. It may just grab it and stop it, and so your line stops moving, or it moves faster or shoots off to the left, and that's when you're going to want to set the hook, because they got it. They don't have hands, so when they grab it, it's in their mouth. So set the hook. And just be a line watcher, and that brings, it's important not to have loops of line, because if you got loops of line going out, you're not going to be able to see any of that anyway.
Decreasing your sensitivity.
Yeah. So I guess that's a pretty good rundown. What do you guys, you said you use a Senko sometimes. I use a fighting frog or a little critter craw or a small chunk.
I like the Zoom chunk.
Yeah.
The one without action, I'm trying to think of what Zoom calls it.
Tiny salty chunk.
I think that's the one.
Yeah.
Just a very minimal action chunk. Like you said earlier, you don't want something that's waving around on a really light jig. It just doesn't perform correctly. You want something that's just pretty subtle.
Yeah. I like
just a little meat on the potatoes.
Yeah, typically any kind of small craw, you can typically bite it down and put them on, or like on those Ike's Micro ones, I'll even use like crappie plastics on those, because they're just so small.
Yeah.
You don't need a ton of action like you guys are talking about.
You just want something to float it up right.
Pretty much.
Something that looks like a crawdad pincher sticking up in the air.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I think that's a pretty good rundown. Anything you guys want to add to that, or?
I think that pretty well covers it for me.
No, I think I got the point across.
Right.
Finesse jigs work good in cold water.
Stop down at K&K. Matt's got a good selection. Like I said, most jig companies have smaller jig offerings, and obviously Bitsy flips and stuff are down there. And
These came from K&K True Value.
Yeah.
Excellent bait.
Yeah, and they and Matt can hook you up with what you need all across the board there. So give it a try. Enjoy it. Good time to fish any time of the year. I mean, it works all the time. So bass like jigs.
Yeah, they do.
No doubt.
All right.
See you next week.
Oh, hey, Brady.